What's up, everybody? It's your man, MG Marcus Grant. And are you looking to stay up to date with the latest goings-on of your favorite, or maybe not so favorite NFL team? Well, how do you do that? You go directly to the source. Every week, Matty Kroll is doing just that with On the Beat, talking to beat reporters from across the National Football League. Be sure to check it out each and every week on 32-Bit.
Yo, what is going on, y'all? It's your boy, it's your host, Calvin Domingo, a.k.a. Steezy A. Smith. And today we are going to be featuring the Arizona Cardinals, brought to you by the 32-Bit Network. We have another edition, another episode of On the Beat. And like I said, we are going to be featuring the Arizona Cardinals. But obviously, I'm not alone. I got a very important guest with me. As you guys know by now, by saying I got another VIG, a very important guest. He's the director of senior editorial content for the Arizona Cardinals. He's also a beat reporter / writer. Please, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, let's welcome Mr. Darren Urban. How you doing? Wonderful. And you're over there in Arizona?
Yeah, just getting ready to actually go to Tennessee tomorrow. They're going to have a joint practice out there with the Titans before their last preseason game. So kind of getting things in order before we go ahead out there.
Right. And initially it was scheduled that they were going to have a joint practice Wednesday and Thursday. But since then, it's just now it's just going to be tomorrow, correct?
It'll be Wednesday. There's travel. It's travel Tuesday, and then it'll be on Wednesday. And yeah, I think given the circumstances and late in the preseason and making sure guys be healthy, it sounds like the two coaches decided maybe that would be the best course of action, is just to have one day.
Right, and can't go wrong with that, right?
Yeah.
But Mr. Urban, before we move on to talking about the Arizona Cardinals, I want to get to know you just a little bit. And so you attended college in Arizona. You've been working in Arizona, right? Covering the Cardinals for the past 23 plus years. I wanted to ask, were you born and raised in Arizona? Are you from there at all?
I wasn't born in Arizona, but my family moved here when I was 6. So I kind of consider myself a native as far as that goes. I always wanted to be a sports writer. That's what I went into. And I worked for newspapers for about 15 years. Covering a whole bunch of stuff, high schools. I covered hockey for a year. I covered NBA with the Suns and some Diamondbacks. But it worked out well for me that at the newspaper I was at, I got on the Cardinals beat. And that was for about 7 years until the Cardinals approached me and asked me to work for them on their website. And it's worked out pretty well for me.
Right. And you talked about it, but speaking of the East Valley Tribune, correct? That was the newspaper prior?
Correct.
So what's the biggest difference between covering the Cardinals for them and covering the Cardinals now for the team website?
Obviously, there's some differences. I mean, clearly, when you're working for the team, there's certain lines you, in the end, cannot cross. But I would say that I've been very lucky that I've had the backing of the people that hired me, enough so that I feel like 90% of the time I cover this team like I always had. And that allows me to hopefully regain enough credibility with the readership that they can come to me as a big beat writer. There's been a lot of changes over who's covered this team over the years. And I do take a lot of pride in knowing that I'm the longest tenured beat guy covering this team. And I probably know more about this team than anybody covering this team does right now. So it's important for me to keep that credibility. And, again, there's going to be some things here and there, but for the most part, I mean, I've had lots of people in the league who work for other teams who have come up to me over the years and said, how are you allowed to write that when you work for the team? And that actually is a source of pride for me, because I feel like I can basically cover the team like it should be covered.
Right. Well said. I mean, you kind of alluded to this, but you've been covering the team for 23 plus seasons now. So obviously you've seen a whole bunch of Cardinals football. Is there anything in particular different about this team than in years past?
Every year is different. I mean, I don't want to say I've become jaded to the preseason and that kind of thing, but I mean, for the most part, let me see what happens when the games count. Let me see what happens as things play out. I mean, do I get senses in my own head of how it could be? Yes. But, I can tell you in 2008, I thought that team might have a chance to go to the playoffs. I never would have told you that they were going to make a Super Bowl. So, so much can change. Teams get hot. There are factors that you just can't see come down the road. It's kind of like when everybody always talks about the hardest schedule for the next year. Well, you're judging that on the previous year, and nobody knows how this year is going to turn out and whether it's going to be a hard schedule or not. And most teams are like that. I mean, you have an idea who the better teams are going to be, but all it takes is one key injury or one funky play and things get sideways. This team in 2016 never should have been under 500 for that year. They were too talented, but they ended up 7-8-1 because of some bad breaks and because they didn't play good football at the right times. And I never would have guessed that. And so, things like that happen.
And that also happened to be the year in which David Johnson, didn't he have 2,000 plus yards from scrimmage that year?
In 2016, he did. He was the one really huge bright spot for that team through the disappointment was how great he played. And obviously, as we saw, his career kind of stumbled after that. And again, this NFL, I think more than any other league, is such a year-to-year proposition because of how injuries can change things, because of how football can take a toll on players probably quicker than any other sport. And just the way the schedule is, because unlike the other sports, it's not as balanced as it is everywhere else. You're playing certain divisions. I mean, this year the Cardinals have to play the AFC West. They're already in a very tough division, and now they got to play the AFC West, which last year they didn't, and next year they won't. I mean, they could, in theory, have a better team this year than last year and have a lesser record. So we'll see what happens.
Right, and look, obviously with the preseason winding down right now, the Arizona Cardinals are 1-1. What are your biggest takeaways on the offensive and defensive sides of the ball? Do you have any sleepers on either side?
Let me try and think about that for a minute. I don't know if I necessarily say sleepers. I mean, Cliff Kingsbury has definitely moved into the Sean McVay, I'm not going to play anybody of consequence that much in the preseason. So it's really hard to get a good sense of what all is going on. I think Antonio Hamilton, I think you can call him a journeyman cornerback. He played for Kansas City before he came to the Cardinals last year, was on the practice squad at the beginning of the year, but did play the whole year, mostly special teams, filled in at cornerback. I think he's had a fantastic camp, which is important considering I think cornerback is probably one of their weaker positions right now. So they needed somebody to step up. So he's one guy that I don't think a lot of people know about. And I do think Dennis Gardeck, a pass rusher who flashed 2 years ago before he tore his ACL and then wasn't the same player last year because he was still coming back from the injury. He's looked excellent in camp, and they need that because they're going to kind of try and go with pass rush by committee. And so I don't expect him to be a 20 sack guy or anything, but I do think he can kind of help. And those are kind of really lower off the radar things because the guys you would normally talk about, we haven't seen a lot from. I expect Kyler Murray to continue to trend up. I think Hollywood Brown will fit well into this offense, mostly when DeAndre Hopkins comes back and you've got that kind of balance. I think when Zach Ertz gets on the field for a full season, assuming he stays healthy, I think he's got a real chance to have maybe the best year of any tight end that this franchise has seen. Now, the bar is kind of low there, but I mean, I do think Zach Ertz has a chance to play really well. So, I mean, these are the things you hang your hat on. And again, we'll see how it kind of plays out as the season goes.
Right, and to kind of piggyback off what you were saying about a Zach Ertz, I know it's probably a byproduct of DeAndre Hopkins not being there, but we saw that rapport that he was able to establish with the Kyler Murray down the stretch, of last season. Maybe they bring that into, the early portion of this season, especially with D-Hop, serving that 6-game suspension. But you talked about him, Hollywood Brown. Obviously, he's been the weapon that's been highly publicized, but I feel like another guy that's been flying somewhat under the radar relative to some of the other guys that have been talked about, Rondale Moore, who had an okay rookie season, where was it 54 catches for 435 yards and a touchdown. And one of your more recent articles, you actually listed him as one of your 2022 breakout candidates for this coming season. Do you think it's reasonable for him to eclipse the 1,000-yard mark with DeAndre Hopkins missing a significant portion, or at least a small chunk of the season, while Hollywood Brown getting acclimated, Zach Ertz is getting a little bit older, Rondale Moore is stepping into the second year? Is that feasible at all?
I'm hesitant on the 1,000 yards, and here's why. Not because I don't think Rondale couldn't be that kind of receiver. But two things. I want to see how they deploy him in games. There was a hope he was going to be used a little bit differently last year. I thought he was going to be used a little bit differently last year. I know for a fact he thought he was going to be used differently last year, and that didn't quite pan out. So I want to see him actually get the ball down the field a little bit, number one. And number two, even without Hop, there's a lot of guys that Kyler Murray has to throw the ball to, whether it's AJ Green or Moore or Ertz or James Conner out of the backfield or Hollywood Brown, maybe Antoine Wesley if he's healthy. I think a 1,000-yard receiver might be kind of difficult to get to. I mean, even last year, DeAndre Hopkins wasn't going to get 1,000 yards, even if he had stayed healthy. I don't know if they would have had a 1,000-yard receiver. They might have had maybe one, but there's so many different guys that I wouldn't be surprised if nobody got 1,000 yards. But is Rondale capable? He's absolutely capable. But if we're talking about like a fantasy kind of like projection, I'd be leery about that just because they have so many different guys they can throw it to.
Right, and I wanted to get into this a little bit later, but let's just get into it now. And you tweeted about this earlier, but the Arizona Cardinals are trading a 5th-round pick to the Buffalo Bills for Cody Ford, who was a one-time teammate of Kyler Murray. And I actually saw this on your Twitter earlier, a conversation that they had after the was it the Hail Murray? Yeah, the Hail Murray, and they were kind of conversing and whatnot. They were talking about how, Kyler Murray was like, we knew we was going to win that game. And so for Cardinal fans who aren't familiar with Cody Ford and who he is, what does he bring to the table? And do you see him starting down the line, or was this merely a depth addition?
You know what? That's a really good question, because I'll be honest, I'm a little surprised that they made this trade. Not that they necessarily needed another offensive lineman because they are banged up a little bit, but to give up a 5th-round pick to get him, I guess I'm a little surprised. I would, as I sit here today without talking to anybody, I would say that I expect that to be a depth thing, and maybe a future thing. I mean, he's going into last year of his contract, but so is Justin Pugh. Will Hernandez is on a 1-year deal. It could be a situation where they want to kind of see where all these guys fit. And Cody Ford is a younger enough guy that if you move on from Justin Pugh at the end of the year, maybe you see a future in him. Or if Will Hernandez isn't quite what you want, you keep Cody Ford next year. I think it might give you some options. Whether he starts now, I mean, here's a guy who was struggling to have a starting job in Buffalo. You've had Will Hernandez and Justin Pugh all through the offseason and camp. I would think those guys would be your starters going into the season. But you never know. And maybe somebody's been disappointing enough that they did feel the need to bring somebody in. But I do know, again, they've had injuries. They want to make sure. There was some questions on who they would have at depth at guard, and this definitely strengthens them. And whether that's worth a 5th-round pick, probably. Probably at this point, it probably would be.
Right, and he's still relatively young. He was just drafted
Yes.
a couple of years ago, and like you spoke on, this could just merely be on top of being a depth move, more of a future type of move. Seeing as how some of those guys are going to be hitting free agency within the next couple of years. But real quick, I do want to transition back to the preseason.
Sure.
And the Baltimore Ravens, they've extended their preseason winning streak to 22 games after defeating the Cardinals 24-17. Did anything stand out to you? I mean, I know earlier we talked about some of the young guys. In one of your latest pieces, you talked about Andy Isabella. Is he a lock to make the roster after last night's or after their performance against the Ravens?
No, Andy Isabella is not a lock to make the roster. Doesn't mean he won't. But I think the back end of the receiver room is kind of interesting, and it's even a little bit more confusing because you're trying to figure out, okay, what do you do? I mean, DeAndre Hopkins will not take up a roster spot for 6 weeks. So do you keep a guy right now basically as an extra receiver because he's out, or do you go just with one less for now and then wait for him to come back? I don't know what they're going to do. I mean, I think Andy Isabella is having probably his best preseason training camp, but it's been 3 years before now, and he's never been able to find a role. And I don't know if that's going to change any, because if everybody's healthy, especially once DeAndre Hopkins comes back, there's really no room for him. So, in terms of guys standing out last night, I don't know if there really was any. Jonathan Ward was off to having a nice game at running back, and there is a battle there to see who's going to make the roster at running back. But then he got hurt, so I don't know how that changes some things in terms of these last couple of weeks and going into the season. Because of the way they played, and this is again something since I've been around 20 plus years. I mean, usually teams, when they come into camp, and I'm literally talking about the first day of camp, out of their 53 guys, they already know 50 of them, right. 49 of them. I mean, we're talking about, hey, who might be the last couple guys on the roster, and then who might be worth trying to slip through the practice squad, because everybody else is pretty much set. So I don't know if there was anybody that's popping that's saying, okay, he's definitely in on the roster, definitely not. Greg Dortch has had he's another receiver. He's had a nice training camp. Is he a guy that has made the roster? I think in years past, I would have said yes. But again, they've added so much depth at wide receiver. I don't know if that happens. So I don't know if there's, again, I don't know. I just don't know if there's anybody who I'm like, okay, this guy came out of nowhere to make this team. I haven't seen that necessarily. Doesn't mean there won't be any, but I personally have not seen it.
Right. But speaking of guys who do pop, and once he does return from suspension, I want to talk about DeAndre Hopkins. And I know he missed some time last year, and despite appearing in 10 games, he never once eclipsed 90 yards receiving. So would you attribute that more to injury? Are we starting to witness signs of slippage in his game? How has he looked in training camp?
He hasn't done a ton because Hop doesn't do a ton in practice usually, and he's not going to be there the first 6 weeks, so it doesn't make a lot of sense to burn him out right now. Right. I don't think his numbers last year had anything to do with him losing anything. I think it had everything to do with how well they were playing as a team. I mean, he got hurt essentially at the end of the 7th game when they went 7-0. He played a little bit against the Packers when they lost that first game on the Thursday night, then missed 3 games, then came back for a couple and then got hurt again. I mean, he did have 8 touchdowns in 10 games. He was going to maybe have his best touchdown season ever, but they had so many guys they could throw it to last year. They had Christian Kirk, they had Moore, they had AJ Green, who was playing well. They had Max Williams, who was playing well. And then Zach Ertz came in. James Conner turned into a much better receiving back than anybody ever expected. Chase Edmonds was around last year who could catch the ball out of the backfield. So I don't think he's lost a lot. And I think he could come back and still be playing at a high level and still not put up the video game numbers that he once did, again, because there's so many different weapons. And I think if they win games, I think everybody's going to be okay, which is usually how it works.
Right. And ultimately, I mean, at the end of the day, that's the name of the game, right? Just winning championships. And so if that's the cost, I don't think he would mind one bit. But I want to talk about DeAndre Hopkins' quarterback, Kyler Murray.
Yeah.
And I know this is a little old now, and I know all the talk about Kyler Murray has been about the addendum that was initially included, in his contract extension and the reactions that came afterward. Just briefly, I do want to just ask, because I'm genuinely curious, what was your view on the entire situation?
My view was this. I didn't know a lot about it. I didn't obviously know about it until it came out. Okay. I looked at it as the whole getting the contract done was a journey. Let's put it that way. Right. And I knew that's what Kyler wanted to do. And, I wouldn't have been surprised if the Cardinals would have liked to wait at least one more year on Kyler Murray, but I don't think they were in a position where they're going to be able to do that. And that's okay. Because I've told people that have asked me this before, just in terms of the money and the contract they gave him, why do you want to give him that? And I'm like, what else are you going to do? I mean, any other team that would have Kyler Murray in the exact same situation in the NFL, not just the Cardinals, they would have paid him. And if they don't, then it all gets all sideways. I wonder, I literally wonder a little bit if Baker Mayfield gets an extension rather than what the situation he was put in, if that changes anything of what happened last year. But getting back to Kyler and the other parts, I mean, for me, I looked at it this way, and I have not talked to Kyler about this, but like if you talk about the clause, let's say, if you already think you study and somebody comes to you and says, we're going to put this in your contract that we want you to study X amount of hours, and you already think you're doing that, and that's the one thing that's going to get you $240 million, and you're probably saying, oh, okay, fine, just give me the contract, let me sign it. And I don't know that's what happened, but I mean, I think that's logical. Now, I understand all the people are saying, oh, you can't do that. I mean, it's easy to say you can't do that when you're not the one that would potentially be risking $240 million. I mean, if somebody tells you this is how it's going to be, or you're not getting the contract. So, and again, I don't know those very specifics, but I think Kyler Murray, in the time that I've been able to spend with him, not a lot, but I've been able to spend some time with him in training camp, he does feel like he's a little bit different, whether that's, hey, you've got a big contract, so you've got to grow up a little bit, or whether that's just a weight lifted off his shoulders, knowing he's got his beyond rookie contract. He doesn't have to think about it anymore, or just the fact he just turned 25 and he was 22 when he showed up, or 23, and people grow up a little bit. I mean, it could be any of those things. It's probably all of those things. And I just think he's in a different place. And I do think he's moving in the right direction. And I'm a Kyler. I don't want to say I'm a Kyler fan because I don't like it when writers say that stuff, but I am a Kyler proponent. Like I believe he can be that guy. And I think he's only going to get better. And that doesn't mean he's going to be a perfect quarterback. And it doesn't mean he's going to be necessarily as good as Aaron Rodgers has been or Tom Brady, but that he could still be a pretty damn good quarterback. And I think the Cardinals did the right thing by giving him the contract.
Right. I mean, it's what you do with ascending talent, especially at the quarterback position. I mean, when he came into the league, the Cardinals were the worst team in football, hence the selection of a Kyler Murray at number 1 overall. But Mr. Urban, I wanted to ask, what does Kyler Murray need to do to not only take the Cardinals back to the playoffs, but to take them on a deep playoff run, especially if he does believe that he's different in that regard, at least as far as like, his talent and whatnot. And what does a successful season look like for the Arizona Cardinals?
Well, I'll take the last part of that first. I mean, for me, a successful season would be getting back to 10 or 11 wins. I mean, could they do more? Sure. But I think with their schedule, if they got 10 or 11 wins, I think that would be a pretty nice season for them. And then once you get to the playoffs, and again, I've been through this before with a 2018, they won a division with 9 wins, and they played terrible down the stretch. And everybody expected them to lose the first round. And then they beat the Falcons in the first round, and then they went to Carolina and won in Carolina. And then all of a sudden you've got momentum and everything changes, kind of like how the 49ers were last year. 49ers weren't a great team last year. They were a pretty good team. They were beat to hell with injuries, but they got hot at the right time. And they came close to finding their way into the Super Bowl when nobody expected it. So if they can get in the playoffs and they can be playing the right kind of football at the right time, that's what matters. Now, when it comes to Kyler, what does that mean? There's got to be more consistency. There absolutely has to be more consistency on a tangible level. I'd like to see him work in the middle of the field a little bit more than he's been able to. And some of that has to do with figuring out, again, at his size, which for the first time, he is starting to acknowledge that his size is a detriment and they got to work around it. He was always pretty defensive about that, but he started to talk about it like, hey, I'm 5'10". There's different things I got to do. That's good. I think that's good. How they always say the first step is admitting you have a problem. Not that that's a big problem, but that's a good stepping stone. And then I think they need to have some health. He's got to stay healthy. I mean, he got banged up middle season and it did hurt him. But more than that, the guys around him have to stay healthy. They started losing some offensive linemen. DeAndre Hopkins got hurt, which was a big deal. And J.J. Watt got hurt, and that hurt their defense. I mean, this isn't all on Kyler's shoulders. And when J.J. Watt got hurt and Chandler Jones couldn't quite get to the quarterback as much as he was the second half of the season, then their cornerbacks started playing a little less than they were because the pass rush wasn't the same. And then all of a sudden it's like it kind of cascades down. It wasn't just a Kyler Murray thing. I mean, the playoff game was wretched, and everybody knows that. But they've got to get everybody around them. And I think that's when, the Rams got to where they were last year because all the key guys stayed healthy. The Buccaneers won the Super Bowl because they stayed healthy, and they beat the Chiefs in the Super Bowl, and the Chiefs were banged up to hell. In the year the Chiefs won it, they did stay healthy. And again, I keep going back to this, but the year the Cardinals made the Super Bowl way back in 2008, their starting 5 offensive linemen started every single regular season game and every single postseason game. Same 5 guys. That never happens. So you need some luck involved with some of this, in addition to Kyler taking a step forward as a player.
Right. And another guy that I want to talk about who's been highly scrutinized, head coach Cliff Kingsbury, right? The Cardinals are 4-10 in the second half of the last 2 seasons. He's 17-44 in the closing halves of every season that he's coached. And that includes 6 seasons at Texas Tech, 3 with the Cardinals. Mr. Urban, I wanted to ask, is he on the hot seat by any means?
No, I mean, he just signed a contract extension of 5 years or whatever it was. So he's not going anywhere. I think he continues to learn the game as much as Kyler is coming into the NFL. The struggles, the back half of the college game, not great, but at the same time, they were probably playing their hardest games of the season in the second half of college seasons, which is usually how it works. Right. NFL, again, injuries happen. Cliff will be the first one to acknowledge that he could have coached better and done some things differently down the stretches of seasons to kind of overcome some of these things. But I don't think it's again all on Cliff's shoulders. Just like I don't think it's all on Kyler's shoulders. I mean, I think they ran into some bad things all the way around. They got to get better. Coaches are the ones, and quarterbacks are the ones that are going to get called out the most when things like that happen. And we'll kind of see how it goes. But if they're in a position to make a run in the second half, or they have a good first half and they struggle down the stretch, I mean, those are going to be the questions. And until they get past that, and until they have a strong second half, that's what everybody's going to talk about. Now, the difference is this year, starting week 7, you're going to infuse a future Hall of Fame wide receiver into your lineup. So maybe that gives them a boost in the back half of the season as well.
Yes, sir. One more question, Mr. Urban, and then we will wrap things up. Where do the Cardinals finish in the NFC West? I mean, we got the Rams, the reigning defending Super Bowl champions. We got the Niners, who are coming off an NFC title game appearance. Obviously, my Seattle Seahawks probably aren't going to be making any sort of noise whatsoever anytime soon. But where do you see the Cardinals finishing in the NFC West, and do you see them making the playoffs this year?
So again, going back to like having to see stuff, I'm not big on straight predictions. I can tell you if this happens, this happens. And I think Kyler's got to stay healthy and to make the playoffs. I think they've got to tread some kind of water when Hopkins is off. They got a very difficult schedule right out of the box. The first 6 games without DeAndre Hopkins is difficult. I think they need to be 3-3 coming out of those games to be in the race. They could be in 2-4, but you can't go 1-5 or 0-6. That changes everything. And 2-4 is going to be tough too, unless you really go on a real hot streak. So I think they've got to split those first 6 games without DeAndre Hopkins to have a chance at the playoffs. That said, if those things happen, I do think this team can be a playoff team. Now, I've got to see some things develop on defense that it's been tough to see so far because of they don't play in the preseason. And they may have to outscore some teams to win games, but I think they're capable of doing it. Now, when it comes to the NFC West, I don't see I see the Rams, again, if they stay healthy, I see them as the best team in the West. So then it comes down to the 49ers and Cardinals. I love the 49ers roster. They've got a nice, strong roster, but they got a quarterback who's never done anything. And I know there's been lots of hype and confidence that Trey Lance can be that guy, but until he does it, I'm a non-believer. I tend to be a skeptic because he's basically, even though he played a little bit last year, he's basically going through his rookie season this year. And those tend to have ups and downs, and that can cost you. Now, it doesn't mean they can't make the playoffs or they can't be the second best team, but just judging on what I see right now, I think the Cardinals have a chance to be the second best team in the NFC West. And if things go right, maybe win the division. But things can not go well, and things can get sideways. I've seen that happen too. So that's kind of where I see this team. I know it kind of feels a little wishy-washy, but I just there's so many things that happen in the course of a football season that changes how things can turn out. The whole don't judge everything after 2 weeks, because teams that are terrible 2 weeks in end up making the playoffs and making deep runs. It just depends on how things kind of evolve.
This is the NFL we're talking about, right?
Yeah.
But Mr. Urban, I lied. Sorry, this is actually the last question.
That's all right.
But after having covered the team for over 2 decades now, do you have any favorite moments or players over the years? And this is actually a 2-part question, but do you have any advice for anyone that's looking to do exactly what you're doing?
I'll take the second part of that first. It's so much different. I have people coming to me all the time asking for advice on getting into this line of work and doing stuff. And I appreciate that. But I'm also stuck a little bit because my path isn't a path anymore, because I'm old enough that I predate the internet, and I worked in newspapers. And, if you would have told me I would be doing all these interviews on camera or doing radio shows, I went to school to write, and I was going to be a writer. And that's what I did for most of my career. If you go back, and I'm talking about a way back, but the first few times I was on television as a writer being interviewed, I would have never put me on TV again or anything again. It was horrible. And it was embarrassing when I go back and look at some of that stuff. But getting reps and doing whatever you want to do, whether it's doing video or doing audio or writing, I think is so invaluable. The other thing too is, and it's gotten lost for me because of how this kind of has all turned out, is find somebody, and it's not always easy, but if you can find somebody who can give you tips and critique your work, that's super valuable. That's why when you go to college now and you go to one of these programs and you get some of these reps, it's so important, because you get into real life and you get a real job. It's tough for the boss to mentor a young person and to teach them the right ways, because they got a bunch of other stuff to do too. I'm kind of in that boat. Like, I have so much to do in my job. It's tough for me to take a young person and just say, hey, and spend a lot of time with them, helping them craft and learn, because otherwise I'm never going to get my stuff done. And so many outlets now that cover sports, especially, nobody wants to pay editors. Everybody wants to do it on a skinny staff. And it's tough, and it's tough for people to get better because, there aren't those mentors. And, I don't know your exact situation, but it looks like you're kind of on your own doing this stuff. And that's awesome that anybody can get a microphone and get into this business, but it's also tougher because you don't have somebody who can kind of like say, hey, work on this part or work on this part. And maybe you do. I'm not necessarily talking about you specifically, but there's a lot of people. I had a kid come up to me in the last week who is doing something else, asked me what it was like to get in the business. He's like, I have this podcast, and I'm like, that's cool, but you got to find something that stands out, because how many people have podcasts now or do stuff like this where the ability to stand out enough that somebody is going to pay attention to you enough to give you a job and pay you real money so you can live your life doing this. Because that's the other thing is, and I don't mean to go on a rant here, but you hit a nerve with me. So many people, and it's a little easier now with YouTube, with ads, you can make money and people can get the content for free, but all these people expect content for free. And the problem with content for free is the person putting out the content, it's much harder to get paid. And if you really want good content, it's better if it's a full-time job rather than a side hustle. And it's hard to get paid. And, I got 2 kids that I'm fortunately going to be able to put through college. I can't imagine somebody doing what I did, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and trying to get in this line of work and then make enough money so I can have a family and get 2 kids through college. It's a lot harder. So that's kind of where I get, but again, I think you work hard, get to know people. This business is like any other business. It's a lot of times it's a who you know. Can I get my foot in the door? Those things help too. But that's my TED Talk. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. In terms of highlights and favorite people, I've been lucky enough to do this for a long time. I covered multiple Super Bowls before I came to work for this team. I covered this Super Bowl when I was working for the team. That was an amazing experience to be working for a team that goes to the Super Bowl. You can't even, for me, other than getting married and having my kids, that month was the greatest month of my life, because you're on the inside of something. All these people where you live, because you're obviously in the town where the team is, all these people where you live would kill to be in that position. And you're not a fan per se, but you're in the middle of it and you have so much invested in it. That was amazing, and just being able to get to know, people, being able to legit text Larry Fitzgerald if I want and say, hey, can I I need to ask you a quick thing, and have him respond to me because he knows who I am because I covered his whole career, that kind of stuff. That's cool. In terms of people I've gotten to know, I mean, there's way too many players that have been great to me and for me, and I consider maybe not friends because it's not quite like that, but like friendly to me that, again, great. And, naming off guys that you would recognize. I mean, Kurt Warner and Carson Palmer, Steve Breston was a great guy. Adrian Wilson works for the team, and I do consider him a friend. And he would have some fun with that if I ever said that out loud. Getting to know Fitz. There's just so many guys. Tyrann Mathieu is one of my favorite guys of all time. Totally genuine. And the list goes on because when you cover one team for so long and you're around the team all the time, you get to know them as people, and you do go. Now it shaves off a little bit of what it's like to be a fan because you don't see these guys as a fan anymore. You don't put these guys on pedestals because you see them every day. They're just guys. They're just guys that you see all the time, and that's okay. But I can't have asked for any better of a career, and I assume that I will probably be doing this till I retire. And I'm extremely, extremely lucky because I know there are a lot of guys out there that would love to do what I do. I know there's a lot of guys like you that are trying to break into this business and probably dream about stuff. And I thank the heavens every day that I was able to get to where I am because I'm lucky as hell.
Well said, Mr. Urban. I mean, you're an inspiration to many. I read your work. I keep, tabs on what you do, and you're definitely a guy that I aspire to be, especially down the line. And, we can't thank you enough for taking the time to hop on the show. You know what they say, though, time flies when you're having fun.
That's right.
So before we do go, though, Mr. Urban, I want to give you the floor. Any announcements, anything you got coming up, just anything you want to, let the fans know, the floor is yours.
I would just say that obviously you can follow me on Twitter. My handle is Cards Chatter, which is mostly Cardinal stuff. So I don't know how many fans necessarily want to see Cardinal stuff all the time, but I think I keep it light and I have some fun with it. And then my website is azcardinals.com. That's where you can see my stuff. And, obviously, again, not everybody's a Cardinals fan, but if you keep up with the NFC West or the NFL, I like to believe I'm the best person to follow in terms of if you're trying to figure out what's going on with the Cardinals. So feel free to give me a follow.
No doubt. I mean, I think your following speaks for itself. But for Mr. Urban, this has been your host, Calvin Domingo, a.k.a. Steezy A. Smith, bringing you guys another episode of On the Beat featuring the Arizona Cardinals, brought to you by the 32-Bit Network. Hope you guys have a great day. Mr. Urban, take care.
Thanks.